Hello, this is Catherine Lockmiller. I'm the librarian here at the Phoenix Biomedical Campus. So likely you are viewing this video because you're going to be in the Interprofessional Evidence-Based Practice course alongside other students within the CHHS at PBC. Likely many of you have already met me too. I hope that's the case. For those of you who haven't, I will be in class discussing this information that we're going over in this video and breaking it down into more and more complex parts. For now, this is an overview that we're going to use as pre-work to prepare us to really dive into our research. So this should be a short video, hoping to keep it just under half an hour. So let's get started. So today, what we want to do is a few things. We want to find out where the PBC Library Evidence-Based Practice website is, and we're going to look at step 3, acquire Q&A. We're going to research background information related to your clinical question. We're going to understand the different levels of the 6S pyramid and corresponding databases. We're going to touch on how you can organize a search query for PubMed. And then we're going to briefly go over advanced search strategies to make your research life just a little bit easier. Okay, so first things first. This is a short link that you can use to access the PBC Library EBP guide. You should go ahead and go there now because you're going to need to access this throughout this lesson. So I'm just going to open it up really quickly so you can see what it looks like, okay? All right. Let's get out of here. And you can always get there through the PBC Library website as well. If you look at the tabs along the bottom left corner, you'll see evidence-based practice. That's the tabs we're looking for. So what we're going to focus on today, you might have already gone through the intro and steps 1 and 2. Today we're going to focus on step 3A through step 3D. So this is a huge process. And really all of these are big processes. It's just that the more you drill them down, the more difficult they can get. We're only going to touch on them very shortly. So keep this tab open. If you haven't opened it already, go ahead and do so now. And let's go back here. You should have the website up, but the other thing you need to have up is the worksheet that you're going to use as we go through this lesson. You can access the worksheet from this link, or you can actually access it from the website. So it should be the very top link under Acquire. You'll see it right there. If you click here, it will take you to a Google form. So this is really short. It's only about 12 questions total. The best way to do this is to stop the video wherever it says stop, and then to fill out that portion, and then to move on. It shouldn't take very long at all to get that finished. And it will help a lot in preparing for class time. All right, so the first step when we're talking about acquisition is finding background information, which, by the way, acquisition follows right after ask and align in the evidence-based practice process. The ask portion tends to focus on you identifying a research question using PICO. In the align phase, you take your PICO question and you try to mesh it with whatever clinical domain or evidence category it aligns with. More than likely, for many of you, it will be therapy, rehabilitation. But there are also categories for diagnosis, prognosis, etiology. There are domains for informatics. So once you find that out, then you can find the databases that will help you sort of align even more closely your question and your domain with whatever research is out there. During the acquisition phase, the step we're on right now, your goal is to take all of those things together and to actually produce a search in which you find search results that you can save and that you can analyze later for possible application. All right, so the first part of that is finding background information. This is the kind of information that's generally available to the public in an open access format. When you do a Google search, for instance, likely the results are going to be background information. I mean, in the broadest definition of the term, even Wikipedia would constitute background info. And in some cases, it's going to provide quite useful information. Background information is what for those of us like myself who are really interested in consumer health and health literacy and consumer health education, a lot of what we do is provide high quality and verifiable background information. So where do we find that kind of information? Because, like I said, if we're searching Google, it can be really easy to get the wrong information. We want to be very mindful that whatever we're looking for has value and whatever we're looking for has context. Some information is not going to be contextual or useful for different populations. Some is. We can help make this easier for ourselves by following just a few rules. So most basically, you're generally going to find very good background information by following standards of care and practice guidelines. So where do you think these would actually be? If you had to say think about your own field, your own discipline, where do you think you could find standards of practice, or practice guidelines and standards of care that fit within that discipline? So for me, I do a lot of work in LGBT health and trans health. I generally know that I can find high quality evidence if I make sure and stick with medical organizations and healthcare organizations that focus on LGBT health or transgender health. One example, which I have on the EBP website, is the WPATH Standards of Care, which is put together by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. I can generally be quite certain that all of those standards of care are very high quality. Usually that's because they get designed by people who are professionals in the field. They have a rigorous peer review process, and they tend to get updated on a consistent basis, once every few years. I mentioned Wikipedia earlier, so encyclopedic information is another good place to find background info, especially if you need definitions for things. Using Wikipedia doesn't hurt. I suggest using it once you have a very firm foundation of your discipline. That way you have a better eye for what is verifiable and valid and what is not, because there are still a good number of instances where you might find outdated or poorly construed information on Wikipedia. Other educational encyclopedic sites that you could use include BMJ Best Practice, the National Institutes of Health websites, obviously encyclopedias, although places like Britannica, the Oxford, those might not be exactly what you're looking for. Another place, even though it technically is constituted as a guideline that you might find encyclopedic information, is the DSM manual. So that's the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual. It's used in psychology and psychiatry to diagnose behavioral health illnesses and disorders, and then to provide plans for treatment. So definitions and drug comparisons. There are a lot of drug comparison calculators and charts out there. You may not need to know a drug comparison if you're not really working in pharmacology, but some of you may very well be. And it doesn't hurt to know where you can find that info, especially if you're looking for research that involves drugs as a control, and then rehabilitation without drugs as a control. So Up to Date is perhaps one of the best known areas for that information, but there are a lot out there. And then finally, consumer health information, which I noted earlier. You can find this information pretty much anywhere. You can find it in high quality newspapers. You can find it on science websites like Smithsonian.org, Nature.com, Science.com. These are sources that the general public tends to go for information. They're not necessarily bad places. The other really good thing to know here is that there are a lot of mobile health apps that involve consumer health information that some of you might want to look through, especially if you're working with populations for whom like a plan of self-management might be really important. So that would be like maybe a population with diabetes. Okay, so let's take this a step further. Let's try searching for background info on traumatic brain injury. Before we do so, ask yourself the following. How much do you know about TBI? Where might you find systems level information about TBI? And what sort of info do you find when you perform a Google search for TBI? I'm asking you these questions because being able to answer them will indicate probably how much you already know about this diagnosis. And if you can answer all the questions, great. If you can't, this is a really good time to inform yourself about traumatic brain injury. So I'll just do a quick search here, and we'll see what Google brings up. Okay, so we'll see here a standard Google results page. We have a few sources here near the top. We have 4 actually, and you'll see that I've already clicked on one in the past. So these come from mayoclinic.org, traumaticbraininjury.com, medlineplus.gov, and cdc.gov. If I were to ask you in class tomorrow which of these might be the most quality resource, which one do you think you would pick? All right, and where can we go from here too? You might also consider, where does this information along the right-hand side of the screen come from when you are looking at Google results? These are typically pretty well written. You just want to make sure that Google's not pulling them from a website like WebMD when they do provide them. All right, so we're going to stop really quickly at this point, and I want you to work through step 3A on the website and the Google form before moving on. Okay, foreground information. We've found our background info. We've become experts. We know how traumatic brain injury works. Consumer level experts, maybe. So what we have to do now, especially as future scholars and researchers, is we have to start digging into the primary research that's out there, the stuff that tends to happen behind the scenes. So foreground information is the research, the data, the studies and the trials, the systematic reviews that all make up our universal knowledge about different subjects. So we're not going to focus on this heavy right now. So what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to go through step 3B really quickly on the website and Google form before moving on. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of things, conducting a search. So let's go back to our PICO questions. You may have one already. If you don't, that's fine. We'll be going over them in class. So what we want to do though is let's try this. Let's go back to our PICO questions, and we can use this one that I've made as an example. In a college athlete recovering from closed head traumatic brain injury, how does self-administered cognitive rehabilitation compare to caregiver-mediated cognitive rehabilitation in strengthening long-term cognitive function? You might want to stop for a second and just work out for yourself whether that PICO question makes sense. What about it is unclear? Do you think that this PICO question could land you results that are applicable? And do you think that this PICO question, what clinical domain or category of evidence from step 2 align do you think that it falls into? What we want to do, though, when we're searching, after we have a PICO question, we want to kind of break it down into those key concepts, PICO. So if you think about it, P is our population. And in this instance, our population is, we have a number of options here. It could be a college athlete. It's definitely going to be someone with traumatic brain injury, right? So we might want to think about when we're building a search query, do we put both of these populations together? Does that matter? Do you think that you're going to find different search results for traumatic brain injury and then traumatic brain injury in college athletes? So how might adding these two concepts together change your search in different ways? Okay, so the I, intervention, we're looking at self-administered cognitive rehabilitation strategies. So a common therapy for persons who've had a TBI, but we want to look at them in comparison to caregiver-mediated. What are the differences and the distinctions? And then finally, our goal, what we want to see happen or what we are expecting to happen, if we thought about this hypothetically, is long-term cognitive function. Okay, so does that make sense? We've broken it down into categories. The next thing we want to do is break those categories or concepts, which we'll refer to in class as concepts, into search terms. So you go from this first part, the question here, down to breaking it into individual components, and then from components into concepts and search terms. We're then going to use search terms specific to our research database. You might want to think about right now, if this were your PICO question, what databases do you think would be most useful? Where would you go for background information? Where would you go for systems level information? And then string our search terms together. That's going to be the ultimate goal. Okay, so now we're finally going to search a database. We're going to focus on PubMed for this lesson. PubMed is really not a database so much as it is an entire ecosystem of databases. And we'll get into that later. But before we ever even use PubMed, we're actually not searching yet. We're actually going to do a few things in PubMed first. We need to ensure that we're accessing it through NAU. And I'm going to show you how that works really quickly. So from the library website, if you go to the home page, you'll actually see a whole bunch of info about PubMed. What you want to do is click the big icon or this one right here. Those ensure that you go through the library's proxy server. You will see this right here if you're doing it right. If you don't see that, you need to make sure that you're going from the right location. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to access all of the articles and research in PubMed. Okay, so from there, we also want to sign up for a MyNCBI account if we haven't already. You're going to be able to do that right up here in the top right corner in just a moment. And then we're going to use the mesh database, which you'll do on your own in just a moment. And you'll see that that is right here. Okay, so back to the presentation. Let's go ahead and stop right now and work our way through the MyNCBI and mesh tutorials on the EBP website and the Google form before moving on. Okay, conducting a search part 2. As I mentioned a moment ago, PubMed is more than just a database. It's more like a platform. And these right here are just a few of the databases you would find in PubMed. The biggest one, the one that you're probably most aware of, even if you don't know its name, is Medline. So Medline is the largest biomedical database in the world. It's home to a couple million papers. It's what you see when you perform basic and advanced search functions from the PubMed homepage. PMC, that stands for PubMed Central. This is an increasingly useful and common database. It's open access. You do not need to be a student or a faculty member to access PMC. All of the papers in PMC are funded by NIH grants. For the most part, you can be mostly certain that the premises of the papers are high quality. You still have to be able to analyze and assess the papers and their validity, but you're still looking at a high quality research database. MESH, which you've just looked at, is the database of medical subject headings. PubMed Clinical Queries is a database that actually feeds into Medline and only searches for clinical trials and review type papers. The NCBI Bookshelf is an open access database of NIH funded ebooks. And then iCite, which you probably won't use very often, is an NIH database that provides insight into journal metrics. Okay, so of all those databases, let's start with clinical queries. I'll show you how to get there really quickly. If you're on the PubMed homepage, there's a few things you could do. You could go right, the easiest one is just going right here to clinical queries. You can also get there from the EBP website. Let's go ahead and click on it. So this is what it looks like. You'll see there's clinical study categories, systematic reviews, and medical genetics. Unless you're working in bioinformatics, you probably don't need to worry about medical genetics so much as the first two categories. You would use PubMed clinical queries if you're at a point in your search where you need primary research and you need high-level research, high-level evidence research like a systematic review. Basically, this functions such that you can find out if there has been a lot of research published on your topic or if there hasn't been. If this does work and you get a lot of results, you might want to go look higher level at synopses of syntheses or systematic reviews or even guidelines. If you find just the right amount of information, you're probably looking in a very good place. If you find nothing, you're probably going to have to back out and go to a lower level of evidence or change your search terms just in case. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot using traumatic brain injury. Notice I used quotation marks there. Also, if you're paying attention, did I use the mesh term or not? And I did not. The mesh term would be brain injury traumatic. Okay, so what we can do here, we've got our P. That's our P concept. We could keep building out, or we could go ahead and search and just see what we get. It's really up to you and however you decide to do it. Just remember that too many results is overwhelming and too few results is likely misleading. We want our search to be as efficient as possible. So for instance, if I search right now, I get 6,675 clinical studies. Now these are things like randomized control trials, comparison trials, case control trials, all sorts of things right in here. That's way too much. We could narrow our scope if we wanted. I'm not going to. I'm going to add the I part of my clinical of my PICO question. Now I'm using parentheses. Parentheses will block off one part of the search from another part. So we have traumatic brain injury or brain injury traumatic, and now we need our intervention. And our intervention is going to be cognitive rehabilitation. A little smaller, maybe not quite small enough yet. That's okay, we can keep going. We have self-administered cognitive rehabilitation. That's a really big search term, so it may not deliver anything, but we'll go ahead and try anyways. See what we get. So we got 2 studies, but 0 systematic reviews. You'll also see that neither of these really, this second randomized clinical study might, but neither of these really apply. So that indicates we probably have too much, or my search terms are not quite well developed. I could do something like self-administered and see what happens here. And just keep toying with it. I get 5 studies at this point. Still no systematic reviews though. So think about this. How could we, if we were going into class tomorrow and we were trying to think about how to find systematic reviews for this actual PICO question, how could we put that together? Okay. Let's go back to our presentation. And just keep that in mind. Too many results is overwhelming. Too few results can be misleading. So you'll notice I used those quotation marks and the parentheses and the words and or during when I was putting together that search query or that search string. Those are called operators. We're going to go over them a little more fully later, but just so you know, as a basic search, you should place exact phrases in quotation marks. So typically a mesh term is going to be more than one word. It's not just going to be, so you can't have mesh terms that are things like brain, which is a mesh term, or you can have entire phrases like brain injuries, traumatic. To search that entire phrase exactly, you have to put it in quotation marks. So for each of your PICO concepts, you will want primary search terms and alternative search terms. We have to get beyond brain injuries, traumatic, and we might even add something like brain concussion. That could be another way for me to build out that search query that I wasn't finding information for earlier. That's better than changing my entire PICO question just because I'm not finding anything. And as above, you connect search terms with and, or, and not. We'll go through these in class. You'll also see information about them on the EBP step 3C of acquire. Basically, when you use and, you're pretty much ensuring that you're going to narrow your search and make it smaller. When you use or, you're probably going to make your search larger. And when you use not, you're likely going to make it smaller. Read through the pages, the EBP pages in just a few minutes when we get to the next stop section, and consider why that's the case. Why would and make your search smaller? Why would or make your search larger? Okay. So one way that can happen, and connects search concepts and search terms. So for instance, if I'm looking for something on brain injuries and cognitive rehabilitation, my search suddenly requires that the results meet both of those criteria. If I search for brain injuries or cognitive rehabilitation, then I'm telling my search, the database, that either of those things is fine, which makes the search even larger. So typically, you want to separate your concepts with and. So brain injuries and cognitive rehabilitation and mediated cognitive rehabilitation and long-term function. That would make a search incredibly small. Likely you're not going to use all four concepts. In most cases, there's simply not going to be enough evidence out there, but they are there just in case. You're going to use or to connect the search terms within each concept. So for instance, brain injuries traumatic, or brain injuries, or brain concussion, or closed head brain injury, all of which would help build out your search. We're doing this because we know that not everybody publishes papers with the same titles. We also know that their abstracts and the tags that they use aren't always going to be the same. Not, which you probably will not use very often, is an operator that gets rid of unwanted concepts in search terms. These are typically things like last names. So for instance, if you were looking for something on swimmer or swimming, you might say swimming, not quotation marks, swimmer, quotation marks, author, which cuts out any authors whose last name is swimmer. This also works, and an example I often give for this is strokes. If you're looking at stroke as in an actual brain injury, like a cerebrovascular accident, then you don't want to find information on breaststrokes, like in swimming. So you would say not quotation marks breaststrokes. All right, so go ahead and stop at this point. Practice searching mesh terms and clinical queries and make note of your findings for class. You don't have to fill anything out for the Google form for this section. Once you've finished with that, move on to the next one. Okay, so advanced search strategies. We're going to go over these a lot more fully in class, but for now, there are a few things that you can do to make your life a lot easier when you're doing research. I highly recommend doing all of these things before you ever even come to class or before you ever even begin research. The first thing I recommend is making use of a citation management application like Zotero. So Zotero, RefWorks, Mendeley, EndNote are all the same. Basically what they do is they store all of your research in one place that you can use to build out bibliographies, in-text citations. Zotero and RefWorks both have plugins for American Medical Associations, so AMA style. So you don't have you can leave a little bit of the work to them when writing a paper. Zotero I tend to recommend because it's free and open access, which means you can keep using it after you graduate. I also recommend using Zotero because of the plugins for Word and Google Docs, which will in the end make your life a lot easier. And the other thing I recommend is making use of NIU's document delivery services, if you haven't already. So DDS, or Document Delivery Services, is just like interlibrary loan at other institutions. It's easily accessible from the main NIU library website. Once you get to that website, you would follow the directions, and you could request just about anything. You could request entire physical books that would get mailed to you. But importantly, you can also request research like papers, like publications that we don't have access to at NIU. Usually when you make a request for like an e-copy of a paper, you'll be able to access it within 24 hours unless you request on like a Saturday or Sunday. It's very quick. So it doesn't really waste any time of yours to give it a shot when you can't get a hold of a paper. If you're on the EBP library website, you will see the link for document delivery services, which you should click on and go through prior to class. The last thing you should do is look at the list of databases on that page and think about what databases are specific to the research you're interested in. We have a lot of databases that we carry at NAU. There are something like 40 health science databases on their own. So which ones do you want to give time to and which ones are not going to be as valuable? That's a good question to think about prior to class. If you go to the very, very bottom of the page, you will see a list of 6 databases that I recommend that cover a lot of ground on their own, that cover summary level evidence, synopsis and synthesis level evidence, and then individual studies, as well as Web of Science, which is a very fascinating database that will allow you to search by citation. All right. So go ahead and stop here. Read through step 3D, that last page I was just mentioning, and then fill out the last bit of the Google form. Once you've done this, you're all finished for today. I'll look forward to seeing what answers you came up with and talking more about this in person. Thank you.